Hello everyone and welcome back to this course on implementing high availability solutions with Windows Server 2019. We're in section 5 of the course, and in this last video of the section we are going to be creating Hyper-V VMs in a disaggregated S2D cluster which we've just configured. So let's get on to the lab and get started. Okay, so once we have that file share configured, once we've done that, we should have everything in place for that other cluster to host our VMs on this cluster that we've just configured. So now the next step is to actually bring in that cluster into our failover cluster manager. So in order to do that, let's just connect to the cluster HE. Okay. And after this is refreshed here, the first thing I want to show you is that we still have the roles in this cluster, as you can see. I also want to show you that if we go over here, we still have our nodes we've configured in this cluster, cluster 1 and cluster 2, which are up, and the other two nodes are down, of course, because I haven't turned them on. Now, this cluster itself, it still has his original disks that we've configured in the previous sections, but we won't use these disks for the creation of these VMs. Rather than that, let's create the VMs as roles and put their storage, their virtual hard disk storage, over there in our S2D cluster, which we've just created. And ultimately, this would be the goal of this section. Now, in order to do that, let's click on roles and let's create a new virtual machine here. I want to create it on cluster 1. This will bring up the virtual machine creation wizard. Let's click on next here. Let's call this VM VM2, and I want to store the virtual machine files in a different location, and that location would be exactly the share I have just configured on our SOFS cluster. So that is S2D SOFS my VM share. Okay, let's go on to the next one. I want a generation to virtual machine. I want to use dynamic memory just like VM1, but instead, because we won't be installing an operating system on this machine, it should be enough with 500 megs of RAM. I want to connect it, of course, to the production network, which obviously I have forgotten to configure. So let me just go quickly back. Let me just bring up very quickly Hyper-V Manager, and let's quickly create the production virtual switch, both on cluster 1 and cluster 2. So let me just right click, connect to server. So this would be cluster 1. Okay. And let me connect to cluster 2 as well. Cluster 2. And then on cluster 1, let's go to virtual switch manager, new switch, external switch, create it, name it production, and I want to allow the management system operating system to share this network. Let's click on OK. Yes, and let's do the same on cluster 2. Create virtual switch, production. Okay, and we'll just need for this to finish. I'll leave them here to finish in the background. And let's switch over to our failover manager. I'm not sure, to be honest, how long this is going to take. I see that on cluster 1 it's created, so we should be good to go now. Let me click on next. It hasn't refreshed yet, so let me just cancel and let me create the VM again. Well, not a role, we want a VM. So new virtual machine, cluster 1, okay, VM2 here. I want to store it on S2D SOFS. Let me see if I type that in correctly. And my VM share. Generation 2, 500 megs. Dynamic. Next. And now we want to connect it to the production virtual switch. Let's click on next. Give it, let's say, 40 gigs. And click on next again. Now, again, I won't be installing an operating system because there are some issues with that share in which I put the ISO. Again, we would need to configure the constraint delegation for any machine to be able to access that share. But for the purposes of our demonstrations here and in the next section, we won't be actually needing an operating system to run on these VMs. So I'm going to click on next, installing an operating system later, and actually creating the VM with which we are going to work with in a moment here. Now, while this is configuring, I just want to emphasize that we are in the at the point now where we configured this VM, which we have it actually running on one cluster, but has its storage on a completely different cluster, right? So that being said, let me just wait for this to finish, and then we will go ahead and power on the VM so we can see that it's properly running here. This will take a couple of moments, I presume. So let's just leave it to finish. You can see it's still configuring it because, again, it's that time it takes to communicate via the storage network. So now, as you can see, it has configured it. Okay, it's bringing the virtual machine configuration, and it is completed successfully. Now, let me click on finish here because I'm not quite interested in the report, and I just want to power on this VM so we can see that if we did everything correctly, this VM should be powering on and starting with no issues. Here we go. We have accomplished our objective here in this section. We have a VM again, which is running on a cluster and has its storage on a completely different cluster. Okay, guys, so this concluded this section, section 5 of the course. I hope this has been informative for you. I hope that you learned a lot of stuff in this section. And I'm also hoping that you will join me in the next section and in the first video of the next section, where we'll be performing a live migration, a quick migration, and a storage migration with our VMs running on our high availability cluster. I hope this has been informative for you, and thank you for watching.